Okay.
My bad, bud.
Hello, everybody. Uh, Good Wednesday to you all watching with us today. Um, we are live and coming to you on Facebook, in which case it's wonderful to be with you all today. If you're watching this later on, hello, it's still good to be with you whenever you're watching this, whether that's on Facebook or YouTube. It's great to be with you no matter what. So, my name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Stephanie McCurry. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking.
And we're going to be talking today about her most recent book, Woman's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War. We're in for a real treat. I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it immensely. And I hope you are too. Let us know where you're watching from. It's always fun to see where people tune in to us from. So let us know in the comments. And if you've enjoyed these videos, and already I'm seeing a lot of people from New York, Stephanie's bringing her New York contingent to the video. Um, if you've been enjoying these videos, or you enjoy this video, some ways you can help the museum is by simply liking the video. Just hit the like button, or share the video, or tag a friend. All that stuff boosts our numbers, gets more people joining us, watching the program, and lets us know that you enjoy the stuff that we're doing. So all of that helps the museum. It's free. It's nice and easy for anyone to do. So that would help us immensely if you can do that. If you want to take it a step farther, please consider becoming a member at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Membership allows us to continue doing what we do, and we've been overwhelmed by your generosity over the course of the past year. And we'd ask if you haven't become a member yet, now is a great time to do so. I'm going to post a link here in the comments. So it's nice and easy for you to sign up. You can sign up for as little as $25 a year. That's only about $2 a month. So that small amount of money, or you're welcome to give more than that, we won't stop you. That small amount of money helps us out immensely and allows us to continue doing what we do. Um, Let me see here. Okay, posting the link there. Splendid. And if you want to stay up to date with all the latest programming that we do, make sure you like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram, across all the social medias. We're everywhere that you can think of. Let's see. So like I said, we got people from New Jersey, Barbara watching from New Jersey, Terry from California. Let me see, Julie comments, says, please advocate and protect the true history of the amazing American women that helped serve in their amazing ways to help defend our liberties. So someone clearly excited about the topic today. Kay from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Mary from Florence, Arizona, Dean tuning in from right here in Frederick, um, someone from Concord, New Hampshire, Zuil from Campeche, Mexico. Excellent. Biglerville, Pennsylvania. So we've got a great and robust crowd joining us today. So excited to be with you all on this lovely Wednesday. Well, we're going to go ahead and get into it here. It was recently International Women's Day, just a couple days ago, as we're doing the program here, and so this is a great time to talk about a great topic about women in the Civil War. So to get us started with Stephanie, I wonder if maybe you'd tell us all a little bit, about yourself and how you came to this topic and to write this book.
Okay, well, I am a professor of history at Columbia University. I teach and write about the 19th century United States and primarily about secession, Civil War, and emancipation, Reconstruction. I was trained in the history of the South. So I do American history, but I'm not American. I grew up in Northern Ireland. I'm an Irish Catholic from part of the city that was very much affected by the Troubles, and which is why my family left, like so many others. So I went to high school and college in Toronto and around Toronto, and came to the United States only for graduate school. But I got very hooked on American history and the history of slavery initially in college. I think because it resonated, the big ethical political questions that it posed resonated so directly with me and my own experience of living in war. And I always did gender history and women's history, but this is the first book I've ever written that's directly and explicitly a women's history, as opposed to the history of women embedded within. I mean, I'm very passionate about that. I mean, we can't write any history without women in it. But this particular book is the most direct engagement I've ever had with my own sort of personal biography, my own upbringing, where I got these perseverant preoccupations with war and legitimacy and violence, and the role of women in wars of national liberation, for example, or independence, which the Confederacy was in this weird, way that's very uncomfortable now because it was a pro-slavery war. But especially the military history of that war is still very minimally, I think, engaged with the question of women in war. So that's why I wrote this book. And in writing it, I was writing about the American Civil War, which is the thing I know the most. And it's archival, it's a deep dive into various aspects of it. But if you have read the book, or if you read the introduction and the epilogue, you'll see that it's also I want people to understand that it's about this war, but it's thinking all the time about other wars and women in other wars and the pattern that has been missed, which I think comes directly out of my own personal history. And you live through something, and then you see how past wars are written about, and you say, well, that can't possibly be right. I mean, I just lived through one. It wasn't anything like that. So we actually managed to recapture a very thin version of the reality that war is, even of the military history of it. And that's where I'm trying to make my mark here.
So much of history, I think, or especially writing about history, I should say, even if we don't realize it, is very personal on some level. There's some degree of personal connection, whether that's something that you enjoyed studying as you were growing up, or in your case, you in many ways lived through this sort of thing. So it's always fun to hear kind of the origin of any book. And I think that makes it that much more kind of impactful to know that it has that sort of personal dimension to the author. So that's very cool. And I want to note, by the way, all you watching, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and drop it in the comments, and we'll get to it. We'll get to as many questions as we can as we go through the program here. But the book, and you alluded to this, Stephanie, the book asks, sort of a very provocative question. It's tackling this question of why women are so often, excluded from, the telling of history of wars. Why do you think that has been the case for so long? I mean, it's a big question, of course, but
Right.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really a philosophical question, actually, and it undergirds all these histories. And because it's so transhistorical and so transcultural and really a philosophical matter, the answer to it has to be bigger than the specific case. So after much thinking about this and struggling over this, it seems to me that the idea that women are outside war, that they actually are, that war is a man's game, the brothers' war, for example, that war is really a struggle between men, and that women are protected parties in it, non-entities to the politics that made wars, and non-participants and non-perpetrators in them. So to the extent that women appear, the sort of normal, the most common from ancient classical history on is they're either booty of war, or they're supposed to be protected parties in it. And that's particularly true of the modern period. It's very true of the UN resolutions on women, peace, and security. It persists into the present. And this really blew my mind. Like, I wrote the epilogue to this book about the UN Security Resolution 1325, which was only introduced in 2000. So this idea that women are sort of victims of war, but not parties to war, certainly not combatants in it, is really, really long. And I think it has two underpinnings. And I try to be sympathetic in my thinking about this, not just hostile, right? Because it's easy to be hostile. So I think one thing is that's really profound is that it's about putting limits on the destructiveness of war. It's one way to say wars would obliterate us unless they have rules of engagement and limits. And we're constantly trying to set limits, like what's an acceptable mode of warfare, what is not. And that's what the international laws of war are about. But norms and customs preceded the writing down. I mean, those laws of war, they date from like the 15th century at least. So they're really old. But even before that, there would have been norms and customs of war. And I think one really adamant limit on war is that women are not the enemy. You don't go in and obliterate women and children, that they aren't the enemy. So they're outside war, they can fall prey to it, but they aren't themselves the enemy. You don't target them. So I think that's a very deep underpinning of a kind of humanitarian law of war that was in custom and then in international law. But the other thing I think that's twinned with it is that thinking of women as outside war is also crucial to maintaining the gender order. Women are different from men. They are different in these ways. The Christian family, the gender order exists is asymmetrical. It requires women to be gendered in a certain way, men to be gendered in a certain way. Marriage is the crucial underpinning of the family, of the state, of the society, and that the idea of women as enemies or soldiers is so damaging to this idea that they exist in a different sphere and that they have a different nature. So that can change obviously over time. I mean, the ancient view and the early modern view and the medieval view and our current view, I mean, it shifts, but there's something that survives these shifts even. And this idea of women as outside war survives these shifts transculturally, transhistorically, I think because it underpins the gender order. And the vast majority of human beings, even now, are deeply invested in that gender order. They might think they want a more equal version of it. Not all did historically. People fought any change in that historically. And so I think that's the other underpinning. And so what happens, I think, is that wars blow things up. They don't actually abide by these norms or laws. Armies and governments have to confront those ruptures. And that's why the histories of the wars themselves, the military engagements, are so interesting. But when they're over, and I wrote about this in the book, this just, I think, is crucial. When they're over, everybody goes about restoring the gender order. Women might have behaved this way in war, but that was an exception. And now the society requires marriage and the family to be reestablished, the gender order to be reestablished. And so there begins this process of drawing the veil over what just happened. There's a silencing in the historical documents. There's a silencing that affects the writing of history. And it's also a question of gender and power. I mean, Mary Beard and other people have written about speech and who gets to speak. But who gets to write history has also long been a man's game. And military history particularly is a man's game. So I think what happens is that this silencing after wars is another transhistorical pattern. If you look at the 20th century, I mean, the World War II obliterated any idea of the women as non-combatants, and it didn't matter. The UN reestablished it afterwards. The histories were written in ways that minimize. So I think part of what happens is some people know that there's a story there, but every single story is cast as an exception and a momentary exception. And because historians work on specific places and specific times, who's in a position to add up all the exceptions and say, oh, for God's sake, we're talking about people's war in the modern period, do we really believe that it, like I could ask a historian of the Italian Wars of Independence, and they would tell me, oh yes, there was this brigade of women. But they're not volunteering that until I ask them. And even in their history, it's written as this exception, you know, almost humorous sometimes, right? Ridiculed or, so this has to be resisted, this idea that every case is an exception.
Yeah, it fits very much in the mold, and the 19th century especially, you see a lot of this. There's this kind of knee jerk of like the enjoyment of telling these kind of quirky stories. Like, can you believe that? Like, isn't this interesting? You see a lot of that, especially in the years after the Civil War. People looking back, like, you know, here's a curious tale of the Civil War. There is a lot of that, highlighting those quote unquote exceptions, as you say. So it's tricky. You know, it forces us almost to kind of recalibrate how we read the history, because some of the accounts are penned like they're set up that way, that like this is kind of a curious tale, but we need to know enough to kind of, you know, look at them a second time and say, okay, well, how curious of a tale was this really? Especially in the wider swath of things. So I think it's a wonderful invitation that you and this book bring us into. And then just quickly, one other point about your earlier point about, you know, the laws of war and whatnot, and especially about the idea of women being outside of war. It's sort of this, you know, what I would say is perhaps a human fantasy to the idea that there is some control. I mean, war is inherently, I think,
Yeah.
you know, uncontrollable force in some ways. You know, when the bullets are flying, they're pretty indiscriminate, as you know, there's countless examples of that. And so the idea that, you know, there can be some sort of codified rules about how things are to be done, you know, in some ways they definitely mean something and they're important, but in other ways they don't, because again, when the bullets are flying, you can't really, it's uncontrollable in that sense.
And
um,
it's worth noting that they're always written afterwards because of the failures of norms to stem, you know, incredible violence and retribution. So yeah, they're written at all because they failed.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And I'm sure we'll probably talk a bit about the Lieber Code before we finish up here, and as to how that did and didn't work during the Civil War. It's something that I've lately become very curious about myself, so I'm looking forward to that. And that whole discussion also reminds me, there's a recent book out. I haven't read it, but I've seen a presentation that the author gave on it by Aaron Sheehan Dean, about just the violence of the Civil War, and I'm blanking on the title off the top of my head, but it explores a lot of these ideas about, you know, how much violence is too much in the Civil War, which seems a paradoxical question to ask when when you're fighting a war, but how much violence is too much? In what ways is the Civil War surprisingly restrained? In what ways is it the opposite of that? It's a very interesting discussion that I think on the surface is actually not a very obvious one to have in the first place. So there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of interesting thoughts underpinning this book. As you're sitting down to start putting this together, I mean, I'm sure this book began and is quite broad in scope. How do you start thinking about, you know, sourcing for something like this, or even how you might want to organize something like that? How did you narrow that down a bit, and what places did you go to end up consulting sources?
Um, yeah, this was a different experience for me than the other two books I've written because it's three very focused studies that I think speak to central dynamics of the Civil War. But it's much more, it's smaller. And it started because of Lieber's Code. Well, not because of Lieber's Code. It grew out of the book I wrote on the Confederacy, Confederate Reckoning, where I had already encountered the fact that the Confederate Army and government had tremendous problems with Unionist women within the Confederacy in places like Western North Carolina, for example, or East Tennessee. And they behaved in incredibly rough ways with those women, torturing them for information about the location of their husbands, et cetera, et cetera. These women were in guerrilla bands. They were behaving in the ways that partisan forces do in all modern people's wars. Okay, and then the Confederate army and government cracks down on them, but there's no lasting residue of that in international law. But I knew about Lieber's Code. In that book, I wasn't interested in the problems that the Union Army had. I was interested in the problems that the Confederate Army had. So then I thought to myself, well, this is interesting because the Union has the same problems. I know that there are Confederate women in the border states, especially, but inside other places, including Mississippi, Alabama, even in the Deep South, right? And plus, they've got enslaved women, men and women, but including enslaved women who are like the enemy within, but for the Confederacy, but they're the ally within for the Union. So I knew that the Union confronted these issues with Confederate women. And I knew vaguely that there was some section on Civil War in Lieber's Code, and that was the first, because international law is about international wars. It's not about domestic armed conflicts that are domestic, which is an interesting part of the story, because Lieber was a law professor, and he really wanted to be in the corpus of international lawyers. He really didn't want to write about Civil War. Nobody gave that didn't belong. So in any case, I started by reading Lieber's Code, and then by working out to the military conflicts that seemed to be most driving the need for the code, which was he was asked to write a code on guerrilla war first. And that was really about the Upper South, the problems that the Union Army was having in the Upper South, and no rules of engagement for people who weren't wearing uniforms. They didn't know what to do, what they were allowed to do. And I knew from reading those military records, just the old sources, the original records of the War of the Rebellion, that they were engaging women as enemies, and they had no means to even hold those women. That women were not, they couldn't charge them with treason. They needed some mechanism for holding them, but they didn't have one. So Lieber wrote the Guerrilla Code, which didn't solve the problem. And it was actually Halleck, who had served in Tennessee, but was then commander-in-chief in 1862, late 1862 and into 1863, who was getting all these requests or sort of demands from officers in the Upper South saying, what are we supposed to do with all these women? We have 200 of them in prison. Are we allowed to hold military commission trials of them? St. Louis was overrun with Confederate women that were caught, apprehended as spies, smugglers, all kinds of prisoner of war networks. So it was in this context that Halleck asked Lieber to write Lieber's Code, which he did, but with no section on Civil War. I saw the first draft of it in the Huntington Library. So he wrote this thing that would make him a big shot in, Germany or Switzerland or wherever, France, wherever this was really being done. And Halleck was like, are you kidding me? Like, Halleck's edits are on the draft in the Huntington Library, and Halleck writes in the margins like, why don't you address the war we're in and the problem of partisan forces and of all sexes? And so he directs him to these field orders that he had written as advice and governance for these guys in Tennessee. And Lieber then wrote this separate section of Lieber's Code on civil wars and what's permissible in civil wars. And he incorporated directly Halleck's field orders, which were specifically about how to hold enemy women accountable. And it defined this new category of military treason, which became permanent in international law. And it was unsexed. I mean, the pronouns were him and her, he and she. They were very explicit that sex is no protection from this charge. So the idea since the 15th century that the quintessential non-combatant, the quintessential innocent person in war is a woman, and then a child, and then a harmless man, and then an old man, and then a priest. And I mean, it all had always proceeded from the archetype of the innocent woman. That was obliterated by Lieber's code. And so it had really lasting effects. And yet this gendered history of it had never been written about.
Yeah, that's I think a very clever way to start. Coming at this topic, it reminds me of or a similar approach of a very different topic that Peter Carmichael employs in his recent book, The War for the Common Soldier. And basically by looking at the fringes of what was the common soldier experience, it gives us kind of a better idea of kind of what was permissible and what wasn't, and then kind of that lets you kind of fill in the blanks a little bit in the middle. In some ways it's imprecise, but I think it's very revealing. And the counter to someone saying, well, aren't those just like exceptional cases? It reveals a lot. The exceptional, I think, reveals a lot about what was perhaps considered more normal. And so kind of looking at the fringes of what was or wasn't permissible, on when it comes to the laws of war and where women fit into that, I think is a very, very clever way to start something like this. It's also fascinating to me that Lieber was sort of kind of an unwilling, or not unwilling, but kind of a reluctant participant in creating this thing that he's that has his name attached to it. It's very interesting to me, and
Well, he
something I
was
didn't
very
know.
anxious to write a code, an international code of war, because he wanted to rank up there. It bothered him that this unimportant American text was being cited all the time, and he really wanted to be the one that was cited. He was himself German born, I mean, he has this history with international war and the Prussian War. So he was actually constantly badgering Halleck to let him do this. He was teaching a course on it at Columbia Law School at that time. But the thing was, he didn't want to write about civil war because civil war isn't in the purview of international humanitarian law or the laws of war. The laws of war are only about states going at each other, not people within states, which is crazy because so much of the 19th century was about wars of national unification that had, and then the 20th century, obviously, these secession wars and wars of national independence. So his section on civil war ended up being way more useful than he had any idea, because France then went at it with Germany and used, I mean, John Witt, who wrote a wonderful book about Lieber's Code, he's a legal historian at Yale, he called it the Arch Occupier's Code. It's a really brutal code for people who are occupying territory. What it allows them to do is just unbelievable.
Fascinating. I'll have to look that up. That sounds like an interesting read. Quick shout out here. We got a friend of the museum, Catherine Bateson, tuning in all the way from the UK. As she says that Professor McCurry taught my American South module at UPenn when I was there, and she's one of the inspirations for why I'm a Civil War historian now. So glad to have you with us, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. That's amazing.
Yes, and we've actually had her on a couple times over the last year, talking about her work in music. So it's always great to hear from her. We've been talking a little bit about this idea already, and I think it's interesting that Halleck is kind of among the people that recognizes that women are very much a part of the war. Talking about this idea of whether women are or not part of war. Was this something that people were kind of actively, or maybe not active, would people during the Civil War have suggested that women were outside of war? Clearly Halleck is suggesting that they're not, while they're fighting the war, but at the beginning, middle, and end of the Civil War, was this something that they would have said?
No, that as I said to start with, this idea that women are outside war really has deep hold on people, men and women both. And I mean, I'm talking on their psychology, right? It's not some out there idea, it's an in here idea. And so any recognition that women could possibly be the enemy, even by soldiers, is extremely reluctant and usually belated. Like a lot has to happen before it gets up here, as in, oh my God, we need the power to stop these women. So there's an always very partial response too. Like, I don't think people can ever make it to the position of saying, well, these women are just as dangerous as these men. But the realities of war, and especially people's war, which is characteristic of many wars from the Napoleonic wars in the 19th century to the 21st century, these wars drag all kinds of people into them. There is no home front, battlefront distinction in the clear way of professional armies. And so these are the places where I think it gets most posited most directly. And so, it takes, I think it's a reluctant, I'm not sure I'm answering your question fully, but it's a pretty reluctant acknowledgement on all sides. But it's not surprising, given that it's people like Halleck who are willing to articulate it and formulate it. Halleck had fought in the Mexican War, another war with a very big guerrilla element, and a war of occupation. Wars of occupation also bring, and of course, as they're moving through territory, they have to hold the territory. And this is where women become really dangerous collective bodies in undermining military occupation. And this is true in, I don't know if you've ever seen the Goya prints of the French attempting to take Madrid. And there are women just stabbing soldiers and horses, and it's street to street warfare. And this is a famous, it's Halleck, I think, about the Mexican War, who says, in cases of war like this, women will step up on the wall and stare the enemy in the face. In other words, the domestic space, or whatever it is in the 19th century, the homeland has been invaded. And who are the people who respond and resist? Well, just like Belfast in 1968, Madrid in the 18 teens, women are part of the people who rise in resistance against armies of invasion and occupation. And that's what the Union was to Confederate men and women. So they're forced into the necessity of recognizing this, but the framework is disturbed by that.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of international and comparison across time is instructive too. And your point about the wars of occupation really bring that out, especially. That's great. Good comments. Ryan, one of our members, says, hi from Colorado. I have Dr. McCurry's book and it's on the shelf waiting to be read. Might have to be sooner than later. So we got at least one person out there that's really enjoying what we have to say so far. Well, in the book, you really kind of frame, these larger questions that we've been talking about around three kind of more specific stories. And I wonder if you might say a bit about each of these, and specifically going off the conversation we were just having, perhaps talking about the ways that women themselves sometimes would, how their actions had the impact on laws of war, as you talk about in your first kind of main chapter in the book.
Right. So the first chapter is called Enemy Women and the Laws of War, and it's basically the story I just told you. So there's one specific woman in the center of that story, but there's also all these other women. And the one specific woman in that story is, am I going to be able to come up with her name now on the fly? So she is arrested for moving between Confederate and Union lines. And she is arrested and released, and then she does the same thing again, I think 3 times. And by December of 1860, wait, you remembered her name?
Yeah, is it Clara Judd?
Clara Judd, exactly. So Clara Judd's name shows up in the 120 something volumes of the War of the Rebellion as this sort of repeat offender in Tennessee, mostly in Tennessee. And last guy who arrests her is just fed up. He won't release her. And they are convinced that she is a spy. And so they put people on her to trail her. And they come up with pretty convincing evidence that she is a spy. And they incarcerate her, they imprison her, but they have no legal means to hold her. So this is where this whole Halleck thing starts to get formalized, because they're afraid of there's going to be retaliation against them for violating the laws of war, or the rules of war. So Clara Judd is a particular actor, and you know, I just have to give a shout out here to the kind of local historians who do amazing work, because when I got interested in this problem and Clara Judd, the only person that was working on this was a woman who was, I believe, in Kentucky, who, I mean, I'd have to check my notes to remember all the names, but you know, I heard her give a paper at a conference. She never published it. Then a version of something related was published. So I was really benefiting from this kind of local close work. And there's been a wonderful book that I actually was a reviewer for, but I'm not sure I can remember the author's name right now, that was just published about St. Louis. And it really confirms what I'm saying. I mean, it's much more than confirming what I'm saying. I was using that guy's work too. But he has the numbers. It just shows you the scale of what is going on in an occupied city like St. Louis. And so that's the first chapter. And then the second chapter is you know, about another central process of a man. So the first chapter is really about what people now call the American way of making war, the sort of no holds barred, massive destruction and occupation. The second chapter is about another central dynamic of the Civil War, which is the slave emancipation and the role of slaves themselves in this. And what interested me here was, and I hope I don't get myself in trouble by talking about this, but I was very impressed by the new narrative of slave emancipation, which had developed since the 80s, right? About Lincoln didn't free the slaves freed themselves. It's wonderful new social and political histories. But what had replaced the old Lincoln freed the slave narrative was another narrative that was only part of the story, which is that Black soldiers earned emancipation by their military service. So the sort of the 80s glory and the larger. And so this always really bothered me because there's about 200,000 Black men in the Union Army and Navy, but there's 4 million enslaved people in the United States in 1860. So why don't we just admit that this is part of the story? But it has this narrative drive that people really love and makes a lot of sense. And it fits the Union records, which are amazingly rich and seductive. Yet let's use the military records to tell the story of slave emancipation. Okay, so I thought, well, what happens in these? I'd already written about the Confederacy and about the plantation as a site of resistance to the Confederacy, and enslaved people in the Confederacy on plantations as actors in the destruction of slavery and the destruction of the Confederacy. So I wanted to take a bigger view of the emancipation dynamic. And the way I did it there was basically to trace military emancipation policy as military policies that would only apply to men, but which had the problem of only applying to men. Because emancipation is evolving as a military policy, but again, with this blind spot of what do we do with the women? So I presume that if Union officers had had their way, only men would have come to Union lines and offered their services. But that's not true. Hundreds of thousands of women and children are fleeing, following behind Union convoys, moving into their camps, into the areas of temporary occupation. And so what I do in that chapter is I look at the way the Union Army and the Union government wrote emancipation policy to accommodate the problem of women, this unexpected problem of women and children. And the secret or the surprise there is how quickly they turn to marriage as the way of ordering and controlling this population. So they kind of generate this fiction that every Black woman who comes into the orbit of the Union Army is some Black man's wife. They need the patriarchal family. They do not want to be responsible for all these independent individuals. It's a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions. They don't know how to feed them. They don't know how to house them. They don't know how to provide medical care. And so in the very act of coming and seizing their freedom in this way that defies everybody's desires except their own, they drive emancipation policy into a bigger and bigger scope. And that's the story I try to tell there. It's one way of picking through the military history of emancipation and showing the challenge that women and children pose to this, and the way that the army and government respond, and what long-term and lasting effect that has.
Yeah, that's such an interesting story. It's a kind of an added dimension onto the the very persuasive argument that, of course, the enslaved have lots to do with emancipation by making their voices heard with their feet, but the idea that not only are men the people driving this forward, but in many ways Black women are as well. This everything you were just saying, and the kind of the other another thing that comes to my mind as to why this is sort of a challenge for the army. It's also this sort of Victorian scandal of these single women, far from home with lots of single men, and also the idea that single women are working for themselves, bringing in their own money, which not unheard of, but it is certainly unusual. So there's
the irony that as enslaved people, men and women cannot be legally married. So here's the government saying, you're this guy's wife. When there's no legal marriage, they've been deprived that. So there's another thing I write about there, is the way the government becomes this kind of marriage bureau during the war. They're trying to get all these people married and ordered, like, how can they emancipate them if they're going to have 4 million individuals? They want to deal with male heads of households like every other government. So we got to get this population organized and disciplined to the heteronormative, heterosexual, patriarchal family. And Black folks just don't entirely conform. They have a very different history. They have very different familial dynamics and kinship relations and intimate lives. And they are trying to liberate their own people themselves. And it's just a really dynamic story.
And it kind of underscores the kind of unsaid, although I'm sure it was said explicitly in a number of places, the whole idea that, okay, you've been emancipated, now you must become emancipated into white society. Like, you can't sort of become emancipated and kind of do your own thing. You need to fit into the structure that already exists.
Well, and emancipated women are a particular problem.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people who still don't want emancipated women. So just think about that for a minute, right? So emancipated Black women they're like, well, and they might say, well, marriage isn't really for me. This is not how I want my family to be organized, or my kinship group. So yeah, it's an interesting story.
Absolutely, and undoubtedly a fruitful place for more and more research to come. A lot more to be said about it, certainly than we're going to be able to tackle here. Before we move on from the Civil War period itself, a few people have asked this in the comments. I want to, mention it on here. Nils asks, have you come across any documented stories of women masquerading as male soldiers? And certainly we know of a number of those instances. And one of the people watching, Frank, is actually from Illinois, the hometown of Albert Casher, aka Jenny Hodgers, who was a woman who spent 3 years in the regiment as a man. I'm curious, I don't know, I don't think you talk extensively about that in the book, but it is something that does tend to come up in these discussions. What are your thoughts on that, and where that all fits in this story?
Well, that's been a fascinating element of the women's history of the Civil War for what, 15, 20 years now, is Deanne Blanton and other people just literally finding these women who cross-dressed and joined the army as men with male identities and names. And, the last time I checked, the number was over 200 of them, and it's probably going to grow. And it's a fascinating story in its own right. And people often ask, I think when they read the title of my book, they expect that this is going to be a big part of it. In fact, the book illustrator kept trying to put cross-dressing women soldiers on the cover of the book. And I just kept saying, no, this isn't what it's about. And the reason it's not about that is I think that's a very particular problem or issue. I was interested in women who posed problems in their identity as women. I probably should have made that more explicit, because whenever you write a book, there's things that are in and things that are out. And you always have to you have to do something. And the logic of my book was not all women who did anything in the Civil War. The logic of my book was, how are the central dynamics of the Civil War, the destructive American way of making war, emancipation, the challenges of making peace, and the dilemmas of post-Civil War societies, how are these things further illuminated by a gender analysis and a focus on women's perspectives? And that it didn't make any sense to look at cross-dressing soldiers in that way, because they're trying to inhabit the public identity of men. What I was interested in is what happens when soldiers encounter women as enemies in their identity as women, or as refugees in their identity as women, or as, bitter Confederate defeatists and lost cause apologists or whatever. So that's the logic of why I don't actually write about them. But yeah, it's a fascinating separate element of this story, and why women would do that. And, it's really fascinating.
Absolutely. And there have been, there has been some good research done on that very topic. But that's a great distinction that you just made in how you conceived of the book that you wrote. Another question from the comments here, this one from Sharita. She says, this is fantastic and resonates with the research thesis I'm working on for college. And she asks about, have you found many similarities between Union and Confederate women and their level of interaction with the war? Did one side seem more heavily involved than the other? And I suspect a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Civil War is, a war of occupation, is where you might go there. But go ahead and speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a Union women's side to this story. And there's not that many people who write about the Union and the Confederacy in the same optic, in the same framework. And I think it's partly because of what you said, that John, that it's the Confederacy, the wars fought on their territory. And it is momentarily in the Union, but not at anywhere to the same extent. But it's also because I think the historiographies have developed so differently. And that's partly, it owes a lot to the fact that in the Confederacy, as in the antebellum South under the slave regime, women's public, say, voluntary associations and institutions were not nearly as developed as they were in the North. Not just in the cities of the North, but in the small towns and the culture of the North in general. So that the literature on Union women is ridiculously focused on the sanitary commission or nursing or whatever. There's not many people asking these kinds of questions about, in other words, it takes an institutional framework, because there are institutional records. This is something I first confronted when I was working on Confederate women, is anytime I found evidence of them opposing the Confederacy, like say Unionist women within the Confederacy, everybody wanted me to, they thought, oh, here we go. This is the emergence of women's rights. They're claiming their rights as citizens. No, they're not. This culture makes it impossible for women to think in that concept. In the North, yes, there's no feminist movement, no women's movement in the South producing. So the best example I can give of the difference is, if you go to the Radcliffe Library, you will find letterhead formal printed letterhead, form letters, just like the kind of text we sent now to our Congress people saying, pass the 13th Amendment. Petition campaigns for emancipation, for the amendment that women's organizations put out, the League of Loyal Union Women, for example, print by the thousands, and Northern women sign them. They have constitutions, they have annual meetings, there's records. There is no such thing for the Confederacy. So social historians can have a field day in the Confederacy, but you have to be patient. There is no separate set of records that says you cannot go to the Southern Historical Collection and say, can I see your records on women in the American Civil War? There's no organization. What are you going to read? Seriously, what are you going to read? There is nothing. When I went there in the 1980s, you couldn't even look up the yeomanry. There were no social history categories. You just had to look up a place or a town or a time or a topic, but the topic had to suit old-fashioned views of the history. So, the history of Northern women and Southern women is equally rich, but the historiographies have been written in very different ways. If you think about Drew Faust, and Mothers of Invention, and the sort of nature, even the cultural history of the South is very different than the cultural history of the North. And I think a lot of it reflects real differences in the social structure and political economy of those regions, and the degree to which women's rights constructions had penetrated the political culture.
Yeah, it's undoubtedly incredibly kind of complex trying to grapple with something on that, with that degree of scope. Northern women and Southern women. I mean, there's so many subcategories to break down from there. But and your point about the historiography and the way that that's been written about over time is a very good one. As we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, why don't you say a bit about your final chapter, kind of take us beyond the Civil War a little bit, and then I'll wrap us up with a final question.
Terrific. Well, I'm really, this is the best part, easiest part for me to talk about, because it's the part I'm working on now. So in a way, this little book, Women's War, the beginning of it is what I was still thinking about when I finished Confederate Reckoning, and the end of it is me writing my way into a much bigger book on Reconstruction. And that chapter is maybe, I think if people read this book, they'll quickly realize that part 3 is in a different voice. There's a different tone, there's a different narrative style, a much more narrative style. And it's partly because I had a luxury there that I never had in my life before. I wrote my first book on the yeomanry, a largely illiterate population. I had the census and not much else to go with. And my second book was on the Confederacy, and especially on poor whites in the Confederacy. So again, there were limitations of sources. So here I have the last chapter of the book is about reconstructing. Instead of reconstruction, I like to think about reconstructing. All civil wars leave a treacherous aftermath, even more so than international wars. And the process of making peace, let's just say we talk about reconstruction with a capital R, as if the United States is the only place that had a reconstruction, which is absurd. Every country after war has to reconstruct itself. This is Berlin in 1945. We just need to get out of this mentality. And so for me, making the thought process about reconstructing is to put people at the center of it and try to break away from these meta categories that we have been bequeathed by what is admittedly an incredibly rich literature on Reconstruction, from Du Bois to Foner to Steve Hahn and everybody else, but where the political economy is really well worked out. But what it's like as human beings to live through it can get lost in the scale and scope and meta constructions of what they're doing. So initially, I just had a source. I thought of it as a source. And it's this woman, Ella Thomas, who was from Augusta, Georgia, and she left a 40-year diary of her life. It's over 1,000 pages long. Parts of it have been published. I had always used it to teach. The antebellum part I teach all the time. The postbellum part I knew was the best part, but I had never written about. So initially it was just a source. And then I realized I wanted to write about her and about her, the enslaved people who she had to let go of very reluctantly when Sherman's army came through her plantations. But she keeps this diary all the way through the Civil War, and well, she keeps it from the early 1850s, I believe, through the Civil War, through Sherman's invasion, into the immediate post-war period, and all the way down to the 1890s. So she's an eyewitness to this challenges of making peace, and she is a incredibly subtle reader of the power relations of her society, but she's also a die-hard Confederate. And she becomes more and more so, like many people, the more the reality of the war recedes, the more she's a die-hard Confederate. But it's the fact that it's a woman's perspective on this long, crucial process that makes it so valuable, because it necessarily takes in the intimate as well as the public. So she's just as focused on childbirth and death in childbirth and the difficulties of making bread. This woman had never made bread in her life until her slaves left her. So you get at basically what I'm trying to do there, what I did in that chapter is what I'm trying to do at a much larger scale in the book I'm writing now, which is try to understand what Reconstruction really involved by looking at the way people lived through that experience and the way every relationship of their lives, including the sense of themselves, white and black, was taken apart and remade in that moment in fundamental struggle over the terms of it. So it's a story of defeat and dispossession for white slaveholders. It's a story of emancipation and self-possession for formerly enslaved people, for people of African descent. And in all of these things, the question of the family, sexuality, the whole previous history of sexual violence under slavery is like a detonator underneath the negotiations of Reconstruction. So I try to bring this massive history down to this human scale and show how complicated it was. And I think in the process, I'm really trying to suggest, crazy as it sounds, that we haven't yet taken the full measure of what Reconstruction involved, and that we ought to stop talking about it as a success or a failure. That seems absurd, to talk about the failure of Reconstruction. What we're looking at is the remaking of a world on almost a utopian scale, from a deeply pro-slavery society to one that becomes a white supremacist society, but after and through a period of fundamental destruction and reconstruction.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting way to look at it. And I think you're absolutely right, that there is so much more to do on the kind of interpersonal level when it comes to looking at Reconstruction. Yeah, I love that. And that my master's thesis was on the Reconstruction time period, and that definitely resonates with the type of sources that I was sorting through. Not nearly as many interpersonal stories as there ought to be. Because the way that any society, especially a democracy, gets made up has a lot to do with people and things of that nature. So I think that's a brilliant way to look at it. Well, you're and I love the way that the book is organized. You're not trying to tell every story, because it's sort of an impossibility there. But you focus on, I think, three instructive ones, or well, broadly speaking, three instructive stories from the war period and immediately afterwards. So I would highly recommend people go out and pick up a copy of Women's War. As we come to a close, I have borderline infinite respect for anyone that writes a book. I know what a Herculean undertaking it is, and once it's been written, then of course it's out in the world, and in many ways it's out of your hands. But you of course still hope things for the book. So what is your hope for someone that picks up the book? What do you want them to take from it, or what have you? Take that wherever you want.
That's a great question. I mean, I just hope it finds readers. I mean, we have a saturated market and world, and it's a world of, self-promotion and agents and I don't know. And I guess I just hope it finds, it finds readers, and that readers feel empowered and enlightened. I hope it widens it. I wanted to open the window, you know what I mean? Like, just look out here differently, let the light in and look out here differently. And, to me, it's part and parcel of ongoing struggles about the importance of the past and the present. But it's also about, I mean, I don't know, it's in many ways a really sad moment, because I think institutions, including elite institutions, are under tremendous assault and pressure, especially financial, and the ability for people to find a life doing what I do is shrinking, and that really worries me. It has been a lifeline for me. I wanted an intellectual life. I had to have one that came with a paycheck. This was the only way I ever knew how to do it. For me, it has been just this marvel. I mean, I still love the essential aspects of the job, researching and writing and teaching, talking about the past. But there's a huge public interest, obviously, in the past, and an enormously generative relationship between historians and journalists right now. But the financial well-being of everything that supports that, of journalism, of the university, of the historical profession, it's all being eroded. And yet the readers are still there, and they still want the books. History books still sell. We do know how to write. People always say, oh, university historians are terrible writers. No, we're not. I don't think we are. I speak English. I don't make ideas so complicated that just to make myself sound smart. So I feel like we have this enormous role to play, and this is one of my small contributions to it. And I'm just always so gratified that anybody wants to hear me talk about it. All of my books have felt to me like a private obsession, and it's gotten a little easier to write them, in part because there's a rational part of my mind that knows that that's not true. Because the first time I wrote a book, it turned out I wasn't the only one who was interested in that. The second time, same thing. So now I think, well, maybe there'll be people who are interested in this one too. But I write it to sort out things for myself, and because I love the process. And I love the conversations such as today about my work, about history in general. But we have to protect I don't even know why I'm going in that direction when you ask me about what I hope for the book, but I hope people can keep writing and reading history books. And we have to find new ways to protect that in a society where the money doesn't really follow any of this very directly.
It's a beautifully made point, and I wholeheartedly concur. I mean, it's most people don't go into the field of history to get rich. They do it because because they love it, and I know I certainly enjoy conversations like this one today. And so with that, I want to reiterate to people some of one easy free way that you can support work like this is to like this video, share this video, tell people about it, because as Stephanie says, clearly there's an interest. So let people know, and that helps. Helps more videos like this happen. You can, of course, become a member of the museum, support programs like this that we do, buy books, keep reading, keep showing there's an interest, and things of that nature. yeah, everyone do your small part to ensure that great content like this continues to be produced, both in terms of conversations, interviews, etc., and research and scholarship as well. So that's a great point, and it's never been more important to what we say at the museum, to continue to bring messages of hope through history. And we've been trying to do that over the course of this last year in the pandemic, coming up on a year anniversary, which is slightly preposterous and mind-boggling to think about. So thank you to everyone who has watched today. Thank you to everyone who has watched throughout the year. Thank you so much to Stephanie for being with us today. It was a joy. And that's all we have for you today. We'll be back next week. What are we talking about next week? Something incredible, no doubt. What? I can't remember off the top of my head. Oh, well, but you can check our events calendar, civilwarmed.org/events, or like us on Facebook to stay up to date with all our latest happenings. So from John and Stephanie, this is us signing off today. Thank you so much for watching.